Good evening, everyone. My name is Sipan Zadorian, and I'd like to officially call this meeting to order. Today is the regular meeting of the Landlord Tenant Ad Hoc Committee taking place on Wednesday, April 26th, 2023 at 6:07 p.m. May we have a roll call, please?
Committee member Jennifer Schultz-Bertolet.
Here.
Committee member Rosmik Gregorian. Committee member Victor Hayrabetian.
Here.
Committee member Neil Marchand.
Here.
Committee member James Sun.
Here.
Committee member Isabella Tevanyan.
Present.
Committee member David Zargarian.
Present.
Right, next item on the agenda is regular business agenda. May we have the report, please?
The agenda for the April 26th, 2023 regular meeting of the Tenant Landlord Ad Hoc Committee was posted on April 21st, 2023 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
All right, next item is approval of minutes for March 22nd, 2003 regular meeting of the Tenant Landlord Ad Hoc Committee. Does anybody have any comments? Can we get a second? I believe committee member Tavanyan moved.
Move.
I second it.
Okay. Next, we have oral communications. Do we have any callers or speakers?
No, we do not.
Right. Okay, so next on our business agenda is an open discussion on any housing-related topics in the city of Glendale. The committee expressed interest in having this type of a discussion. We talked about when it would happen towards the end of the, our journey together. And this is your opportunity to speak on anything that you've held back that might not have been related to, or we didn't allow before because it wasn't related to the rental rights program or the mediation program or the other things we spoke about. But this is your chance to bring up any ideas that you have that might be related to housing. Lucy, do you have something?
I just wanted to add that your thought, you were all selected because you had experience and expertise in different areas of landlord-tenant relationships. And so in that regard, the council was very specific in the scope of work. But in the course of the work that we have been doing in the last about 9 months, you each had expressed some ideas that were perhaps outside the scope of work. And so we had talked about having an opportunity to capture all of those ideas, and we will put that as part of the staff report to council, mostly because we just don't know what their response will be, but this would be your time to provide that type of feedback on some of the areas that we've been talking about that that was perhaps outside the scope of what we had talked about before. And maybe for the sake of just order, we could maybe start on one end and make our way to the other, and we could start on this end and make our way that way. We could do it however, but maybe we can try to I think as people start sharing their thoughts, it might spark discussion with others, but perhaps maybe what we could do is go around the room and then and identify broader areas of discussion, and then allow the group to make it more specific.
Staff can certainly bring up a few things that previous councils, either this council and or previous councils took up, and where they went with that, and you all can chime in later on. But as we had said before in earlier presentations, a previous council had looked at the issue of rent control, and in lieu of rent control, they had said no to that, and in lieu of that came up with the rental rights program. Since then, the state has come in with a rent control program as well. At one point, a council looked at the issue of a rental registry, requiring all landlords in Glendale to annually sign up, provide information about the number of units that they own, the number of them that are being rented, the size of the unit, bedroom counts, things like that, with the intent of maintaining and gathering information, be it rents, in any particular period of time that we'd be able to call for. With that proposal for a rent registry came costs, and those costs are being looked at as being passed on to the landlords. So there was a discussion as to whether or not that was an issue of fairness. If the rental registry wasn't going to be used for anything other than maintaining data, should it be something that a cost is passed on to the landlord? You know, we needed to see a benefit for them as well. So that idea was shelved, and I think at one or two meetings, the discussion of a rent registry came up at some point. And I don't know, Sipon, anything else that we've looked at over time that, for whatever reasons, just didn't go anywhere? Okay.
But rent registry was one of the main things that we discussed. Different types of rent control, 50/50. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, yeah. Not all units would be subject to rent. We had different ideas when we were talking about rent control for that, the then council. We talked about having half the units rent controlled, half market rate, and having them designated and things like that as an option. So we looked at different things.
Attorney services provided by the city. That was rolled around a little bit.
Oh, for certain rental clients. Yeah, that was looked at. So a couple cities have programs like that. More recently, Pasadena took actions to establish their rent control board by selecting their members. It went through, it passed on the ballot initiative, then it went to court, and the court ruling recently upheld the measure, and so Pasadena went through the process recently in appointing their members to the rent control board. That's it, really.
I mean, I guess I have some comments, especially after our last meeting and thinking about where Glendale is. And, you know, the rental rights program started in 2019, and then sort of, you know, COVID hit, and it kind of feels like, while implementation has been done, it didn't really get a chance to fully develop, and especially after our last meeting and after some of the people have spoken in front of this committee, you know, the idea of a mediation or an entity that could handle disputes between landlords and tenants would be a good next step for Glendale, because it seems like those are the most pressing issues for all people right now.
And I think we had said it earlier in some of our presentations, but we do see a need to, with the pandemic and all the various state temporary measures that were passed as well, and county measures, we feel that it's necessary to kind of reintroduce the rental rights program back to the community as well. I think there's been a lot of time, there was an inability of us to be able to go out and effectively educate and promote the program. A lot of in-person meetings we had prior to the pandemic, all but canceled and things like that. So we see a need to go out and do that more. And then, of course, your idea about some type of entity helping with the mediation and or just relationship would be good.
Peter, when was the rental registry actually discussed last?
Sipon, do you remember?
I
How long
believe it
ago?
was the same time as the rental rights, rent control, those discussions from 2016 all the way up to 2019.
Well, I mean, from looking back from 2016 until 2023, Glendale has come a long way. The U.S. has come a long way. California has come a long way. It's a different world that we're living in today than we did in 2016. I think some sort of database is essential for the city and the community to react to and have some sort of approach. If we don't have the information, how is the city and the community going to implement anything that makes any sense? I mean, we're talking about a rental rights program where, you know, a specific individual that's asked to leave gets some sort of money, but we don't even know how many units of, apartments are available to the city. We have zero information, and we're making these grand gestures and statements about how we're trying to help the community when we're basing it off of nothing. So I think some sort of database, just so we can use some sort of mechanism, some data, would make sense.
Well, I'm sure everyone has, I agree with you, by the way, and I'm sure everyone has heard my stance profoundly on, yes, I do believe we need a rent registry, but also we have to be able to have a way to connect the dots, like you were saying. So in just simple layman's terms, we've been dealing with this committee, illegal rentals, unauthorized rentals. And how do you track that? If there's a rental registry, it's simple. You're not registered, We know now why. Maybe it's an illegal rental or not, whatever. But like you said, the data will show that. The education that we need to have, the type of workshops or something between the people and the city is, I think, critical, very critical. My issues are also with code enforcement. These are people who are understaffed. So they may be doing a wonderful job here and there or whatever, but if you're understaffed or if the urgent needs are urgent, the default can, in my opinion, cannot consistently be call 911, get a lawyer. If it was that easy, then people wouldn't need another type of service. We're helping people try to stay housed. So we want to keep them housed, get attorneys and everything. And then we also know that attorneys are not just like, yeah, I'll take your case. Yes, I'll take your, I've had people go through 10 attorneys just to get someone to listen to their case. And most of them, a lot of them, and some experiences have not wanted to take the case for whatever reason. Not because they couldn't win the case, but it could be just for various reasons. So I think if we have a better way of starting ground zero, this unit is legal, this unit is a rentable unit, okay. When it's not, there are issues. We need to see what these buildings and apartments look like. Are you renting properly and appropriately? Then fine. Then we go from there. Something came to me today, some information that they may call in or may not, but it's talking about, and we brought this up before, an elderly person who has lived in her unit for 20 years. Her unit is a studio. I'm reading what was sent to me. She's lived with her grandson in that unit since he was 2. He's now 22. In February of this year, she got an invalid 30-day notice to move due to allegedly having an unauthorized tenant, her grandson. And now the harassment has started. Verbal harassment against her. I don't know if I have her age. So the grandson did move out. He's basically just living pillar to post right now. She's lived in her unit since 1995. As far as we know, the person said there is not a lease. They do have a landline. They have records to show from to date that they've been living there. They pay the money via money order. So now there's the property manager has asked her to move out since she is a senior and other tenants are young. The tenant has faced harassment. Tenant wants support and has asked support from the Glendale Tenants Union. So I brought this up before, how important it is to protect people such as the elderly. And it's right here happening in Glendale when we think it's not happening. We'll know what's happening if we then find out your unit is.
You know if that's how many units in that building?
That I don't know.
Because that's the big question too.
And I was asking those questions. It is, we have the address of where it is. They did say that. So, yeah, it's, if I can find the address, but I'm not going to say the address, but the street. We have that, and I know there's a lot of apartments over there.
Elk.
Elk, thank you. The manager has barged in her place several times. I mean, it is hard for me to accept this type of behavior from adults, number one, and people posturing themselves in a position to take advantage of those who may be at a disadvantage, period. And we just have to get better with this. And we don't need to get better 4 months down the line, 2 months. It needs to happen kind of immediate. So I'm hoping that with us in place too, one of the things that we can do is help the city service this area. And this is where I think the mediations comes into play. I'll leave it there for
Yeah,
now.
because I mean, right now, where does that, who does that person call in the city?
Exactly.
Is there anyone, or?
And we, go,
Okay.
you? Yay, so fun.
I was just going to ask, do you know if they've called the rental rights program staff to
I don't think
talk about
so.
the situation?
Right, and I'm hoping that, again, they'll call in. This is what I emailed you about earlier.
Right, yeah. It's got in trouble.
So, yeah, so I think, when we talk about the rental rights and being able to keep track, and it puts onus on someone who's trying to do, bad behavior when it comes to renting.
Just to piggyback off of everyone, I am a big proponent of mediation, but I'm not sure the effectiveness of it. What I would like to see is something of maybe a monthly legal clinic. I know there is a hotline that we can call into, but maybe just a legal clinic that people would come in once a month with certain issues that they may have, maybe one day for tenants and one day for landlords. That could include also questions about the rental rights program and also other legal issues that they are currently facing. I know that a lot of what we've talked about is about renters and tenants, but I just want to kind of clarify that not all landlords are unscrupulous or heartless or uncompassionate, and not all tenants and renters are victims or helpless. A lot of us, these days, with the advent of the internet and everything, Google and everything, we're pretty savvy people, renters and landlords alike. And there are two sides to every story. And maybe if they have a place to come to, maybe once a week, and then say, look, this is what's happening. Is this something that I can, is there something that the city can help with? Is this something that I need to retain a lawyer for? And then the landlords would have the same kind of mechanism, because not all landlords know all the rules or regulations as well, especially the mom and pops, and say, I have a tenant who has this issue. Is this something that I have to be concerned about, and so forth. I know there is a hotline, but there's nothing. When you get to come in and speak to someone in person and kind of show them some of the evidence that you have, it's so much more satisfying than to have someone, over the phone and say, this, that, and whatever. But it is a concern that I've always had, rather than having these black and white ordinances. There are two sides to every story, and the facts are important.
So being an attorney, then you would want them to have, provide legal advice then to the tenants and or landlords?
Yeah, legal advice, or maybe it's just someone who, from, the Tenants Association or from the Apartment Owners Association, someone where they have some sort of guidance, whether it be legal or just, someone who knows the housing regulations for the city or the state.
But I believe that's what we have discussed. I feel we've done well in supporting both sides, whether you're a tenant or a landlord. I believe I've spoken that way, appreciating both sides. And yes, we do have to get the story. We've delved into how the mediations can look as well, and I think it would serve both. I don't feel anyone has taken one side, even though we have tenants and owners here. and our neutral person. I don't think any of us has really taken sides. I just bring information up that's when I have it to present it, you know? And we have to remember too, we never know how anything is gonna go until we start it. That's just in life, period, with anything. So we don't know if we're gonna be able to ride a bike until we get on the bike and try. It's with anything. So I believe in pilot programs. Something can start for 3 months. If it's just like, yeah, then, you know, we get rid of it. But I do like your ideas as well, to be honest. I feel that that's an option as well. We definitely need to provide the community with something, a soft place for people to land and for us to properly vet the information as well.
Yeah, I know there are services out there, but then just kind of centralize into one room or one building would be really helpful for people, I think.
And remember the services too, because since GTU is grassroots, people go to grassroots a lot of times. They feel like they can make things happen. People I call grassroots organizations usually are the ones with boots on the ground, you know. So I think again, that's what's really important, that you have people that are just truly vested in helping both sides and filtering the proper information, you know, for us here in Glendale, so we can have a safe space to live and thrive. That is one of my goals, to be living in Glendale and have, you know, a place where we all collectively can, you know, live and thrive.
I just want to add something about the rent register. What it came, the rent register place on the table is because we have so many properties that they were sitting, just trying to collect, to gain in the price market only, and they don't place it to help the crisis in the many different cities. Because I was in LA, Wilshire, and I believe it was Western or Vermont. It was a whole building, somebody else bought it, have not been rented. They raised the prices regardless, but no maintenance. So when people start to complain, they say that they don't have, you know, income because most of them are empty. But they don't say why it was empty. It was on purposes to get empty and not to pay, because the main idea is to gain by the market price later. They don't want to deal with tenants. So they find out that. So that's why it became the rent register. Because it's so many houses, buildings, offices, everything that is sitting there empty because they want to gain with a market price different through the time. That's why it came. When you mentioned it, that landlord, they have to pay for that to rent register. How much money we are talking about?
Do you remember, Sipon, what some of the figures were on the rental registry program? How much of a cost would be passed on to landlords?
It depends on the size of the city. I think it went anywhere from like $20 per unit to upwards of 140.
Pasadena is going to be around 160 or 180 a unit.
To register units for the rent control program?
Yep,
160.
yep.
So it's $20, right?
Per
so
unit.
I don't think it's
That's a
gonna be
lot of
all the
money.
time.
That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And also to stop another issue that I can remember, you know, that we were trying to talk about is the problem that we have, very serious problem that we have right here in Glendale, is that parking space. The landlord took that way to, if I'm going there and I don't have a car for any reason at that time, no, you don't deserve a parking, so it's mine, I can rent it, I can make a profit out of that, and then later we got a car. My son got a car. We couldn't get any parking space because with the lease it didn't came together at the time, so I couldn't get back the parking spot at the time. So those kind of things, I think, is very greedy. It's very greedy. I rent a house, I want my place to park. Even I don't have a car, I have a guest coming in. Everybody has a family. No, nothing. It was very sad at the time, but we learned. Yeah, that is the two items that I think that is very important, the rent register too, because we can see when we talk about rent register, it's only about apartment or offices too.
So we're just talking residential now?
Okay.
Could you expand on your comment with regard to rent registry? Are you saying that landlords are refraining from renting the units so that they could artificially raise the rents?
No, get the profit for the year just with the market price of the property itself.
What do you mean?
I mean, I buy this one, I don't sell it, but I'm making money if this one is gonna cost me now $10 and later I can sell for more money, $30, $40, $50.
So they're deciding to forego the monthly income just so the property, and wait until the value of the property goes up.
Exactly, yeah.
And then once the property value goes up, then they're selling it.
Exactly, and
That was
avoid
also
all the
LA
headache.
though,
Yeah,
which-
and avoid all the headache that it
And
has.
that's one of the side effects, the horrible, horrible side effects of rent control, I have to say. I mean, those kind of, maneuvering and trying to get around the rules, it's what happens when you put those price controls into place, but.
We have two callers on the line for this.
Can we wait until we've heard from our committee members
Sure.
first?
I guess.
We
my
saw
turn?
you writing.
Yeah, I've been writing. Okay, well, let's see. Where do I begin? As the song goes. Going on 30 years almost as an attorney. I will tell you this, ladies and gentlemen, this is about relationships. And it's about sensibility. You're dealing with something that's essential that people need, which is housing. You need to have sensible laws and sensible people. You're going to have some people that are not going to be in that continuum. We live in a free country, yet we use the term rent control. I don't think we use the word control in any other laws, but we use it when it comes to rents. I think we should look at that. The housing sensibility laws is what maintains these relationships. There's only 3 types of courts that I've been in that I see sheriffs. One is a criminal court, one is a family law court, the other one is a UD court. There's a reason they put sheriffs in those courts. It's because people are potentially dangerous or they're in a state of mind that is discomforting, and their actions may get the better of them. So at the same time, though, I can tell you that with all the cases, and I've done thousands of these, the great majority of them have settled in the hallway because people come to their senses. No other area of law have I seen landlords who are rightfully owed a certain amount of money throw away millions, if not billions of dollars in waiving rents, making other accommodations, because that's part of the sensible thing to do. Likewise, in having represented tenants, I've seen tenants make concessions that are also sensible in light of what they're dealing with. There isn't a lawyer out there that has handled a habitability case that couldn't tell you before they go into the courtroom, this one is a winner for the tenant or a winner for the landlord. I will tell you this, though, there are lots of lawyers out there right now that are filing requests for jury trial and playing games because in the state of California, possession is the carrot. You don't have to pay rent. You can just sit there as long as you want. You can use the court system. You can file motions. You can request a jury trial and basically make sure that possession is not returned. That's not sensible. In the state of Nevada, it doesn't work like that. So what happens here? Some of these laws and this system is actually instigating advocacy. There is an incentive for lawyers to keep the tenants in there. And let me tell you, I have heard of scenarios where the landlord agrees to pay a relocation amount or agrees to forego rent, and the first thing that happens is that the lawyer that's supposedly helping the tenant is preying on the tenant and taking that money away from them. That's not sensible. And so that's where I go back to this. A lot of times we are sitting here talking about how do we make people coexist? Well, the simple start, I think, begins with what we've kind of talked about as committee members for the last 9 or 10 months, however long it's been, which is there's got to be some sort of education up front. People have to know, I have a right to a lease, I have a right to month, I have a right to so on and so forth. And I think part of that starts, or almost all of that starts, with the initial meeting of the two people. Two people want to get married, they kind of know what they're getting into, and then things change afterwards. But at least they know what the person's name is, they know their height, they know their weight, they know their appearance. If you were to hide that from them and make this, what was that, married at first sight type of a situation, it makes things a lot harder. Well, at the initial disclosure, at the time the lease is being signed, we need to have clarity, both for the tenant and for the landlord. We've talked about certain things to be put on the paper that advises the tenant, look, this is what you're getting into with this person. We've obviously had one of my co-committee members has been very passionate about illegal tenancies. A landlord can make a representation on the lease initially that this is a legal unit, and if it's not, then there can be potentially a consequence for that. Now, the law does have certain consequences for illegal tenancies, obviously, but I think that having that initial disclosure, if it's untruthful, can lead to other consequences, damages, compensation, whatever, which will again create sensibility. Controlling rents is, in my opinion, something that the state has enacted because of the potential abuses that ignore sensibility. At the same time, the rent control laws that some of the cities have tried to enact to protect their citizens are still not sensible. And that's the one thing that I would recommend to the city council here, that they understand that the city of Glendale is unique. Though we are neighbors with Pasadena and with Burbank, Glendale is not Pasadena, nor is it Burbank. Glendale has its own character, its own identity, its own community, and that's why people choose to live within the city lines here. So in order to do that, though, I mean, there's certain things that I would just throw out as suggestions to the council to consider. For instance, I can tell you the story about the LA County official who was living in an apartment that barely had a comma in it and ended up buying a multi-million-dollar property because of the money that was saved because of the fact that they were a long-term tenant. Should that person be afforded that type of a protection? Maybe. But to that extent, I don't think so. One example of sensibility that we had talked about before when this whole idea of rent control in the early 2000s was being flushed out was, why not have a mechanism to protect long-term tenants, to reward them for being there for 5 or 10 years, but to allow rents to be adjusted to what current market values are calling for. When you have someone living a stone's throw away from Santa Monica Boulevard in prime La Cienega, West Hollywood, paying $1,103 for a 2-bedroom apartment, there's something wrong. That owner is not going to repair their building. They're going to resort to tactics. They're going to try to find any excuse they can. They're going to rip notices off the door, and they're going to do everything possible because you have made things totally insensible for that person at that point. And it's nonsense. So the city of Glendale, if they're going to consider at some point, the council wants to initiate some measure of, okay, what do we do? The state used the 5% CPI measure. Was that a good idea? Well, you saw what happened to CPI. It shot up. I'm sure there are some people that are upset about that calculation. Back in the day, believe it or not, the whole notion that we have relocation in the city of Glendale was initiated by the attorneys that were technically landlord biased at the time. That was something that was offered as a mechanism in exchange for when people are asked to leave. Because again, you're dealing with relationships, and we foresaw at that point that there was going to be certain situations where someone might want to leave. Family member wants to move in, they want to improve the property, so on and so forth. So I empathize with the scenarios of what my fellow committee members have seen, but I have sat in hallways holding tenants' hands in jury trial waiting for the verdict, and I've also sat in those same hallways holding the landlord's hand waiting for a jury verdict, okay? And I will tell you that most of the time, if not almost all of the time, the verdicts have usually fallen along sensible grounds. And it's been relatively obvious because the cases that deserve to go to trial, most others will settle. Now, if you have initial disclosure, you also have to have simplicity in the ordinance. It has to be something that the two parties can discuss amongst themselves without having to bring in an escrow, a lawyer, or realtor, or someone else. There's no reason to do that. If we can get past these first 2 points, I think the rest of the relationship usually goes pretty smoothly. One thing that I would strongly recommend that the city council do is to have, given the temperature of what's going on nowadays with rental laws, you can't leave this for another 20 years. I think every year or two there has to be some follow-up as to what's gone on with the state law and how can we make sure that Glendale stays current with state law, and also what can Glendale do given its uniqueness. So for instance, we have a relocation formula here that's different than state law. State law says 1 month rent, okay? Again, back in the day, that was the highest number that was available. And so everybody grabbed at it. And we said, well, why don't you consider where rents might eventually get to? Because HUD may eventually lag behind. And they didn't listen because they wanted the bigger number. Just give me the bigger number, man. And we gave it to them. And then now everyone says, oh my God, 2 times HUD plus 1,000? That sounds ridiculous. Well, that's what was asked for back then. So is this something that was right or wrong? No, but you have to keep up with the time of what's going on. And that definitely hasn't happened. So if this, and I don't think we need to have 12 meetings. People can get together and, in a couple of meetings and say, okay, where does the state stand? For instance, right now we have the 5% plus CPI. Does Glendale still want to stick with the 7% before you get into the non-exempt portion? Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but it would certainly be nice to have that discussion ongoing. That way, at least the people and the landlords know this is what's going on. 20 years ago, we offered a suggestion to have landlords voluntarily, because they were talking about doing a systematic code enforcement, block to block. We had talked about landlords voluntarily contacting the city and affording the city staff to select 50% of the building units, because they want to do everything, like I think once every year or once every 2 years. Was it 4 years back then? Okay. So we said that the landlord could voluntarily offer the units for inspection by contacting the city, and if they did, that they should be given some reprieve from the inspection for a following additional term. That was shot down. Imagine if 50% of a building, a landlord said, come on in, take a look. And if I don't comply, we also even allowed measures to go into additional units. So the idea there was give an incentive, and that will in itself also, again, go back to creating sensibility. That didn't happen, okay? Between 2008 and 2012, I will tell you that in my office, I got very little phone calls of tenants calling me saying, the landlord didn't raise the rent. What's going on here? But after 2013, those calls were plentiful, okay? And I think, again, it's understandable that you're going to have these types of markets upping, swinging, down swinging. Banks are sometimes going out of business. Big companies are going out of business. And then you have new investors that come in. Every time I've watched a city council hearing, I don't know how they do it, but these developers come in and they say there's no environmental impact, but we're going to put 500 more units on Brandon Central. It'll have no traffic effect whatsoever. And yet they go in and they have that, but now we're going to sit here and focus on, these other properties and try to say, why is this property owner being a little bit mischievous? And yet, by the way, the new developers have 15 years of protection to do basically what they want, okay? So Is it fair for a new investor who tries to speculate to raise the rents by 100%? Absolutely not. But if they're willing to compensate the tenant, and that's something that there's a mechanism that they can agree to, I don't think anybody has a problem with that. But is it sensible to just do that based on a 30-day notice? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But at some point in time, if the neighbor across the street is getting $2,500 for a 2-bedroom and you're still sitting at $1,200, there's a problem if everybody else on that block is getting somewhere in that range. There should be a sensible way to say, okay, you're a long-term tenant, you may be an elderly tenant, you may be a disabled tenant. We're going to afford you certain protections and incentives, understanding that this is still a business for the landlord and it's still a mechanism that has to make sense. During the last 5 years, during COVID, insurance has gone up, utilities have gone up, trash has gone up, everything's gone up, yet the city of Los Angeles has said no rent increase whatsoever, not until February of 2024. What is the motivation for any landlord in that city at this point in time to turn around and help these people? I mean, where's the logic there? Where's the logic? And yet we're sitting here and we're worried about these types of laws being an issue. Now we get to another item, which is what happens to the whole notion of the tenant who is moved into the new unit paying $2,400 and has a problematic tenant. One thing that has to exist in these housing laws has to be a way to excuse yourself from a relationship if it's just not working. Because what that person does is they kind of start to consume the building and it kind of ruins it for everybody. There is no protection here, interestingly, in any of the rent control laws when you're dealing with a tenant versus tenant situation. And I can tell you I've received a lot of calls from tenants who say, I have a problem. Who is it the landlord? No, it's my neighbor. Well, I'm trying to get the landlord to evict them. They said they can't do it because there's no reason to do that. Well, okay, I guess you and your neighbors are stuck. Okay? There have been situations where people have suspected prostitution going on. There's minor children that have been around, illegal drug sales going on. Yet the neighbor says, the landlord tells me they can't prove it, and all of us, none of the tenants want to get up and go to court to testify because we're afraid our tires are going to get slashed and there's going to be other retaliation. So I listen to all this, and I'm all for making people feel secure in their homes. But I think that the sensibility of what's going on has to allow these types of relationships to be existing, involve disclosure, involve clarity, involve simple ordinances, and if all else fails, there has to be some fail-safe mechanism to go ahead and say, okay, this just ain't working. There is no law that forces people to stay married. Why? Because at some point it just doesn't work. It's an irreconcilable difference. And if you reach that point in a landlord-tenant relationship, you should also have some excuse. The tenants have it, which is to give a 30-day notice, but the landlord and other tenants don't have that opportunity. And those are the people, by the way, those are the people that are going to clutter the phone lines calling code enforcement. Most of the time, you can tell the person that's creating the issue is a troublemaker, either landlord or tenant. It's a son of a gun, and you know it the minute you pick up the phone and you talk to them. The idea of having a resolution program, I think it's great, but I think it takes people to be on the same page. I applaud all of the plaintiffs and the defendants in all the UD cases I've handled that we have reached quick, amicable, sensible, generous, time-saving, agony-saving resolutions in courthouse hallways. And part of that is, even though I may be the tenant's lawyer or I may be the landlord's lawyer, at some point in time you have to bring your experience in and say, this is what solves the problem. And indirectly, you kind of have, that's why people behave in those courtrooms, because there's a sheriff in town somewhere. And you need, whatever you do, if you're going to do this, you need to have people with experience, because it's about the identities and the personalities involved. You have to know the person that's just there just to run it their way. And you got to tell them, you're full of it, you got to get out. And then you're going to see the situation where the landlord's trying to take $450 to clean a unit, and you say, I'm sorry, that's ridiculous. Doesn't take $450 to clean a one-bedroom apartment. Don't tell me that, okay? And if the person's been living there for 10 years and you're claiming it suddenly needs paint, that's ridiculous, okay? So those are the things that you need in order to cut through this BS, because I'll be honest with you, there have been many times where I have sat there with my client and I've said, you're full of it, and no one's gonna buy this crap. And that's what you need, is someone that can turn around and say that to the person that's playing it. For the people that genuinely have a dispute, yeah, then you can put the cards on the table, and I'm sure they will work out. And I guarantee you most of those probably resolve themselves. You're gonna have the oddball cases. You're gonna have the problems, the horror stories. We all have them. I've seen cases get removed to federal court multiple times, involuntary creditor bankruptcies. I mean, I've seen everything you could possibly imagine. Those just happen. It's just like the person who happens to be going through a green light and the other guy didn't stop at the red and they're no longer with us. Unfortunately, that's part of it. But I think that if you want to initiate part of this, I think we'd also talked about the sheriff in town. I think you can utilize city staff to kind of break those ties. I've mentioned this before. I think that some of the code enforcement people are practical. I've had people call me up and say, you know what, I'm closing it. That sounds ridiculous. I've had other people say they've cited and said, no, I think that looks like a kitchen in that guest room. And, you know, it's not a guest that's there, it's a tenancy, and you're trying to make it an illegal unit. They know it, and that's the wealth of their experience also. And if you have sensible people in that position, they can actually help resolve this without it ever getting to the lawyer's office. As far as the courts and the politics involved, I don't want to go too much into that, but I'm concerned that nowadays too many people are saying what needs to be said because of their own self-serving personal reasons. I think there are judges that are afraid to do things because if they do, there's going to be repercussion for making decisions or telling people, sorry, you got to go. There are people that will immediately complain about judges thinking that they're biased or racist or this or that just because the decision went against them. And I think that that's unfair, because I think given today's social climate, that also puts handcuffs on people that are genuinely trying to do the right thing. And as she was saying, people that are vested and passionate about helping, but I just think they're like, why bother? Why bother? For what? To get my neck into this thing? You know, now we had COVID. What's going to happen in the future? Now that the legislative authorities have gotten their hands on, hey, stop paying rent. You know, or you can file a declaration. I don't believe that every tenant that's filed a declaration genuinely means it. And I also don't think that every landlord that got PPP money deserved it either. There are stories that I have heard. I've had people try to consult with me about creating phony tenancies so that they can tap into the relief money. Does that exist on that side too? Absolutely. But we didn't stop the insurance companies from collecting their premiums. If you went to the doctor's office, they got their doctor's visits. McDonald's got paid for the food that you bought and everything else. But somehow landlords, well, call it a debt. Go get it. Thankfully, the relief program came in, but at some point, is this being sensible? I would have maybe considered freezing utility costs. The city of Glendale created this new waste management program, and they've changed vendors and all this other stuff, and costs have gone through the roof. Well, okay, I can tell you one thing, that the cost of that waste removal has been more than 7%. I guarantee you that. Those increases were more than 7%. So when this all comes back to the city council, what do? They say, okay, let's break it down into 3 or 4 pieces. The beginning of the relationship, the property, the middle of the relationship, and the end of the relationship. That's all you need. If the property, as she's saying, and I respect what she's concerned about because it sounds like she's had a personal experience and it bothers her because I'm paying attention to her. This has bothered her. It's personal and it's important to her. So if that is there at the beginning and it says, look, this is where we stand and we are standing on an equal footing. These are my expectations. These are my rents. If rents go up, then I'm protected. If rents go down, then you're protected. We understand where the unit's supposed to be and we leave it like that. I guarantee you're not going to have this many problems. And then there's also the other thing too, which is, can fixing rental laws solve the other economic issues that people may also be dealing with? Me personally, I will say that my kids have a cell phone that I didn't have. And they have an iPad and they have a subscription and they have a Snapchat monthly payment. My parents didn't have to pay that. Those are extra burdens on people. People are trying to keep up with the Joneses. When you're bombarded with social media and there's targeted advertising and people are spending money, unfortunately, some people need a relief. They need to feel good. And they go out and they shop or they do something and then they realize, oh my goodness, I may come short a little bit here. That's not their fault, but it's also kind of the times that we live in. So what can be done there? That's way beyond the scope of what we're here for. But I think that the council has to focus on this. Again, you're not dealing with new investors raising rents. What they're doing now that I'm seeing is they're walking up to the door, knocking on the door and saying, hey, I'll give you 20 grand if you leave. 15 grand if you leave. And the tenant says, okay. And it's conversation's over. So from my standpoint, having been in the trenches, this, folks, is what works. Because I've seen that 6-year-old hanging onto his mother's skirt, not knowing that there's going to be a sheriff at their door in 2 weeks. That kid should be able to sleep at nights. But sometimes that kid is in that situation for reasons which all this stuff could have avoided. And that's the sad part. That's the sad part. So
thank you for the comments. I think this may be a good time for us to go to the callers. Do we still have 2 callers on the line?
Oh, we have 3 now, but we can.
And what is our call limit?
I'm sorry.
Do we have I just want to check on the agenda, the time frame for caller. You allow 3 minutes, I think?
Correct.
I think initially we decided 2 minutes. We had a conversation.
2 minutes? Is that what
If
we
I'm not
discussed?
mistaken.
Okay. As long as we're
Originally.
consistent.
Yeah, it was 2
Thanks.
minutes.
Hi, Linda Numier. You are on air and you have 2 minutes.
Hello.
Hi, Linda Numier. You are on the air and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to say that I support the idea of having a mediation board. The reason for that is we would have more than 2 minutes to talk, among other things. I also don't think that the city has grappled with the severity of the problem, nor have they come up with any really viable solutions. And I think, as has been stated many times, the value of sensible people on handling these issues would be valuable for the city. Now, let me say this: I was a school teacher, and in 4 years ago, I was told that I had to pay an increase of 60% rent 4 or 5 years ago. This was because Blackstone took over my property. So I was forced out. The lady that is calling tonight, the lady that you mentioned earlier on Elk Street, is having the same issue in the sense that her rent or her living has been threatened by the landlord. Actually, it is a different issue. There are over 20 apartments in that building. She has lived there for many years. Because her grandson was booted out, he now is homeless. That is horrible. This 2 minutes for talking is very difficult. I've also worked with tenants who have called even attorneys on the tenant landlord board and haven't been able to get an answer, a reply. There are not enough attorneys who can handle low-income tenants. There are not. It's not rocket science. Finally, there are buildings all over Glendale that are standing
Linda,
empty.
you are out of
450
time.
Just ask her to wrap up.
Can you wrap up, please?
Yes, there is a building on 450 Pioneer that has several hundred apartments that are empty, several hundred rooms that are empty. We need to be able to talk to people directly, to really hear their problems, and then as sensible people reach an understanding. So I support the idea of a mediation board. Thank you.
Hi, Greg Asaturian, you are on air. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, and my name is Greg Astorian. I am the Government Affairs Director for Glendale Association of Realtors, and pardon me, I've been following your meetings for a while now. I just wanted to go on record and correct some of the statements that were made in there in regards to rent registry by at least a couple of commissioners. First and foremost, rent registry did not was not talked about in 2016. Rent registry is a recent decision that the City Council made, and it was made in August of 2021. So about 2 years has passed since rent registry was basically decided against at the council level. Some of the reasons why it was decided against it had to do with a lot with the privacy. By the way, in the hearings, we didn't have any one tenant that raised an issue with rent registry being struck down. Privacy was a huge issue for the landlord as well as the tenant because a couple of years before that, on a state level, there were 3 attempts, i.e. AB 1188, that they tried to implement rent registry, and it didn't even clear the committee level. So there is a lot that can be said about rent registry and why it's not going to help you. And I will tell you, we have told the staff, Mr. Zovak's team, that Glendale Association of Realtors has a ton of information about the number of the units, what is vacant, what is not, and what the rents are, and which ones are affordable units and which ones are not. By the way, it's not only us. City of Glendale has got access, as they have been implementing Section 8 vouchers for about 10 years now, or decades, I believe.
Mr. Asaturian, you are out of time.
Well, let me finish my thought. I mean, it's not as if you get people calling you every single time that you have a meeting. I think it's germane to the issue that I finish my thought. May I?
Please conclude your thought.
Yes, of course. So City of Glendale, not only through GWP, but also through the Section 8 vouchers, has access to all of the affordable units, and they can very easily have a registry of their own if they don't already. With that, I really appreciate the work that all of you do, and thank you for allowing me to speak. Thank you.
Hi, Pamela Augustin. You are on air, and you have 2 minutes.
Yes, good afternoon. And I would like to request the same amount of time that was given to the previous caller. My name is Pamela Agustin. I am a commissioner to the Rental Housing Oversight Commission of LA County, overseen by the Department of Consumer and Business Affairs. I am also a longtime Glendale resident. And I just want to share that as you consider mediation as this commission, you realize that what we need is actually bolder policies for Glendale. Recently, the Department of Consumer and Business Affairs published a report that recommended to the 5 Board of Supervisors the need for a right to counsel, the right to a free attorney during eviction defenses. Because 90% of landlords have attorneys, less than 10% of residents, tenants, have attorneys in court. I am also an organizer with the State House LA County, and I can tell you that our district and in Glendale, we have the least representation in court filings. This means that there are a lot of 5th District residents, Burbank and Glendale residents, that are being evicted right now without any representation. I have seen time and time again residents being evicted despite having a COVID-19 declaration reason, despite having turned that in to their landlord. And why is that? Because eviction court says that if a tenant receives a summons and complaint, they have 5 days to respond. Many times, tenants believe that they were protected just because of a so-called moratorium. This has been one of the worst lies that we have faced in the pandemic. So, mediation, it's cute, but what we need is a right to counsel. What we need is code enforcement. What we need is to uphold fair housing laws. The caller that has been discussed, the lady who lives on Elk Street, she was told by her property manager that the reason that they want to evict her is because she's an elder and they want college students. Commissioners, you know very well if you follow housing law,
Dustin, you are out of time. Please conclude your
issue.
thoughts.
And that is the thought. We need right to counsel. We need code enforcement. We need to fund State House LA County. And definitely, we need rent control for the city of Glendale. We need to follow the steps of Pasadena, Pomona, and other cities that have been doing this during the pandemic. And I encourage this commission to invite the Department of Consumer and Business Affairs or your own fellow commissioners to join in this body to inform you about the laws that are being discussed countywide, because we need stronger protections.
Thank you for your time, Ms. Augustin.
So I will agree, if we can have our callers be able to speak a little longer, just due to the fact we are a new committee, and the fact that we're getting some traction, I really do appreciate that. We need to be able to hear from the people. Do it, if we set it up like city council, I think they get 3 minutes in the beginning and maybe 5 minutes longer at the end. I do respect the caller who said, listen, you're barely getting calls, so let's take ours. I totally agree, touche. I totally agree with that. So thank you for allowing them to go a little bit longer, and thank you to the callers.
Yeah. If I recall correctly, we voted in the beginning for the 2 minutes, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's how we decided the 2 minutes originally, but I guess we can change it.
No other callers? And no cards to speak?
But it's also a little bit difficult because we don't really have powers to do anything about anything anyway, right? Yeah.
Well, we are looking for recommendations, so you have that ability.
Yeah,
you
it's
know that.
just hard to hear these. It's hard for me to hear the specific stories and not be able to say, okay, let's work on that one, or,
Right.
you know.
And it's part of what our city council does, though, to be
Yeah.
honest. They
Yeah.
hear the story. That's the main thing. And if you don't hear the story, you won't know. So we have to hear the story, and we have to provide the space for them to be able to do it, in my opinion.
If I could ask, I had a couple ideas, but also a couple questions that came up during some of the discussion I'd like to go back and forth with you on if I can. Jury trials. The ability for a tenant to request trial by jury on a UD, is it correct?
Yes.
Fairly new requirement?
No, it's not a requirement. It's in the Constitution. You can have a right by trial by jury.
And how much longer do you feel that extends a case out?
Okay, so great
Briefly.
question. Great question. A lot, especially nowadays.
Are we talking it extends a case out that would normally be solved by another 3 or 4 months, or 4 to 5 months?
I think at least. I haven't been in a UD court very recently, so I couldn't give you the exact estimate, but Before you would, if you were set up for a UD trial and it was a jury case, they could sometimes get you out same day. I think now they're calling you back several times, which might get kicked a couple of months, and then it gets processed differently. There's a different preparation. Years ago, in commercial tenancies, you could contract away the right to jury trial, but that was overturned by a case that says that obviously that right should exist. One of the discussions that I've had with colleagues is, if you have a bench officer, these UDs are not very complicated. Why would you take citizens away from their lives and have them sit and decide whether or not the plumbing is defective or not, and whether or not you do away with the whole notion of jury trials and evictions altogether? Yeah, I mean, that
And the cost difference too. I mean,
And the
the
yeah, but
it's
obviously
$20,000 versus,
Yeah, but that's
two.
also that's also done as a strategic measure. Okay, your landlord's attorney's going to tell you you have to front up a $10,000 or $15,000 retainer. Guess what? We'll take $7,500 and 90-day waiver, and we'll be out. Which one are you going to go with? The guarantee or the this? And so that's kind of used in that respect. Again, the problem is some of the attorneys they are taking more of that money. And they're saying to the tenant, okay, Sam, you get $2,500, I'll take $5,000.
Does the attorney get the fees up front for a jury?
It depends. It depends on the structure of what you have. You have situations where the lawyer either looks at the lease and says, okay, there's an attorney fee provision, or there's no attorney fee provision, or how much can I push this eviction? And, I'll charge you, and they can do what's called a blended fee, where they say, okay, I'm going to charge you so much per hour with a max of this, knowing that they can get, because that's the other thing too, is in the UD side, the landlord lawyers and the tenant lawyers know each other. They see each other frequently. And there are some like myself that do both sides, but some will do exclusively landlord or some will do exclusively tenant. So at some point, what they know is they'll say, oh, so-and-so at that office, I know what they'll take. Oh, who was the case filed by? Oh, it was filed by this office. You know what? You give them 90 days and a waiver with a $7,500 offer. They'll sell their client on that any day of the week. And so the lawyer already knows going in, if I'm representing you, hey, I'm good for $7,500, and if I can max you out at $5,000, you come walking in and say, what happens? And I say, I'm sorry, but you have to leave in 90 days, and here's $2,500, and I'm keeping the $5,000. It's right here in my contract. So that's the thing too is, and then there's, obviously there are attorneys that don't work like that, but there's other entities that are working off of grants and so on and so forth. So I don't know what their motivations are, but I'm just saying is I've seen situations where people have told me of situations where the lawyers are just signing settlement checks. And that's the basis. I've even heard one person told me that the plaintiff's attorney will actually call the tenant's attorney and tell them what cases they have so they can go sub in on those cases, and they know there's some bantering that can happen. I mean, it's a mess.
All right. And then typically once a judgment is made, the ability to have the sheriffs come out and issue their notice, and by the time, how much time is asked for? How much time is allowed typically once a judgment is issued before a tenant must move? Are we talking 30 days, 35 days?
No, if the judgment is in favor of the landlord, I believe under 1174 of the CCP, it has to be immediate. But the pragmatic of it is you need to get a writ issued, and it'll take 2 to 3 weeks, again, depending on the clerk's and the sheriff's schedules and processing times.
So 2 to 3 weeks for the writ, serving, and then sometime period after to be gone.
Yeah, I mean, they have to first post the 5-day notice to vacate.
Okay.
And then, it's never on the 5th day. It's usually a couple days after, but.
Okay. And then I heard a lot about code enforcement. There needs to be more code enforcement. And I just want to say that anyone who has concerns about a condition of a unit is allowed to call the city and ask code enforcement to come out and inspect their unit. A tenant does not need a landlord's permission, excuse me, to allow them into their unit for an inspection on a complaint. So that right is there now. And I don't know if I was hearing, because Committee Member Herpete mentioned this, I don't know if I was hearing then when people are mentioning code enforcement, is there a desire to have a systematic inspection of every rental unit in the city on a particular time frame. In the past, there was a very limited pilot program in which a select set of properties were inspected over time, and then that program was rental units, and that program was discontinued after about 5 years, and it required ramping up of hiring up an additional number of inspectors, as well as staffing, administrative staff to administer that program. So I don't know if I heard by code enforcement, are people aware that they can always call in and complain, or is there a desire for systematic, every rental unit gets inspected every year or every other year, whether anyone calls or not?
I think people are aware that they can call in. People are very quick to say, I'll call the city. So I don't think that that's an issue. Most of the tenants that I speak with are usually pretty well informed about that. I think the question is when we were originally talking about the systematic program back then, the whole notion is that this was intended to maintain the quality of the housing. So it wasn't, hey, we busted you, No. And so that's why at the time, one of the suggestions was, rather than making this difficult for the city where the inspector wants to come out and the landlord says, oh, geez, I got to kick this can down the road because I don't want them to bust me. We said, look, why don't we focus first on the landlords that are willing to voluntarily offer their units up for inspection?
All right.
Because once you get rid of these people, you kind of know that these are I guess for lack of a better term, the better landlords, okay? They're going to have better properties or better maintained properties. So there wasn't, let's have a systematic code enforcement, but at that time, that was the process of how do we not burden the system by getting the ones that are out of the way that don't need attention and focus on the bad apples, so to speak. That's where that part was. From the standpoint of code enforcement, where I think it can be helpful, for instance, I'll tell you this, I've had many times where I've had tenants come in the door and have had a viable non-payment of rent case, but they didn't go through the procedure of notifying the city, putting the landlord on notice, following it with a writing. It's all verbal. It's all, I denied, everyone's lying or denying things. And what happens is the California Code of Civil Procedure requires a process in order to defend a non-payment of rent case.
So rent withholding, you mean?
Even with withholding rent or making the repair and deduct remedy. But I think a code enforcement officer, for instance, that says, I've dealt with a situation where the woman was claiming that her drawers didn't slide correctly. That's not habitability. Well, if you're going to tell the landlord, I'm not going to pay the rent for that, and a code enforcement officer says, ma'am, I think if that door slides or not, you better pay your rent. You might need a different mechanism, like a small claims court or something like that. But if you gamble and that notice expires, you're now out.
Any other thoughts on code enforcement from any other members, or no? Okay.
I just had a question. Does code enforcement apply to single-family rentals in Glendale, though?
Sure.
It does?
It
So
does.
if somebody has habitability complaints about a single-family rental, they can, okay.
Yes.
Also condominiums?
Yes.
Everything?
If it's a
Okay,
rental, yes.
yeah, but code enforcement is pretty much because of a lot of buildings are falling apart, and we don't understand how 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, you pay almost $2,000, and another one more decent, beautiful, very good maintenance is paying the same much of money. So it's like a car. When you're going to buy a car, the years and the condition is telling you how much you're going to pay for. What is not a little bit more trying to, they don't want rent control, but at the same time, we need to control how ugly are the buildings. And people, they have to live there because to move out of the building is a lot of money that you need to make the move itself. Is only my comment.
And I should clarify, for condominiums, the inspector could go in and look at the interior conditions of the unit. Common area stuff, exterior stuff, that's an issue between the tenant, property owner, and the HOA. So we are limited on a condo aspect of it.
Can I comment as well? I want to just make sure when we talk about code enforcement that, because we've had tenants complain here as well, and my story has come forward as well to a degree. When a tenant moves out, it shouldn't be code enforcement stops. Okay, so they moved out. We don't have to keep checking on that property anymore. Yeah, you do. If nothing happened, the tenant moved out, but it doesn't mean the property is habitable still, or what a property got cited with. We still need to go back and make sure those things have been fixed. And tenants move out because they don't want to be harassed. They don't want their lives in danger. We heard that from a tenant here, Justin, talking about the same thing. When you feel someone in power that owns your roof is willing to, I don't know, barge in, which happened in my place, a forced entry, while I was on a Zoom with children in a classroom. And the unfortunate thing of him not being arrested was when things are moving fast and we have to watch this and they're like, this tenant's not doing this or this tenant hasn't done this. What do the police say? Oh, this is tenant landlord. We're not involved. So I think we need to work on that with the police department as well. That's something that I think City Council needs to look into as well, and get the story, vet the story. And the only thing I didn't do at the time was pull my Ring camera because it was clear what happened, very clear. Later, thank goodness, Glendale Police Department worked hand in hand with me, I will say. Thank goodness they did. And when they did, when I remembered the camera that taped it and they saw it, they did go back and revise some of the language in the report. But for me, I was like, why not go arrest the person? When a person's life is at stake, and that's what concerns me, not just for me, from other tenants that were in the same situation or similar situation, they felt their life was at stake. And then it becomes a bigger thing. And then I think, had we just done this in the beginning, if people just did that in the beginning, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation. If this apartment was never allowed to be rented because we knew it was an illegal rental, or if people just moved faster, that's all. One thing can lead to something bigger. But I appreciate everything you said, and I agree with a lot of what you mentioned. You made things very clear, and I appreciate that you've supported both sides. You've really given us a lot of information, and I think those listening to understand how things work. So to piggyback off something, though, this is why we need the kind of like workshops that I'm excited that we create. I love the term housing sensibility. That's a thing. I love that. Can we coin that? And when we were saying things like UD cord and CPI, you know what that means. A lot of us may know what that means, but that's just the general public. So this is exactly why when we say UD, we mean unlawful detainer, and what does that mean? And when we say CPI, we need to be able to clarify, and this is what our workshops will be able to do so people can really understand in their language, whatever that language is, what these words are. Because I think the worst thing in politics in general, when people are talking and it's like, who are you talking to? You're clearly talking to a person maybe with this type of education or with this type of power or this type of money. But there are people that are just people, and that may not have a certain education to understand the language. They may not have there may be language barriers. So I'm all for understanding your audience, and when you really want to see a DEI come into work, you talk in a way that people can understand as best to everyone's ability, period. So I love having this workshop so we can then even break down these terms of what UDI, UD, and CPI, and all the other terms we sometimes use, what it actually means.
Thank you. And then there were a couple of comments about the city being able to have enough data that it maybe doesn't have to require a rental registry of landlords and all that. And we've looked at that issue, staff has, and There is some data we can get from GWP about the number of units in a building that have a GWP account, but it doesn't necessarily tell us the bedroom count. It doesn't tell us any type of amenities that it might have. It doesn't tell us a lot of information that anyone would be looking for when deciding between a one-bedroom unit here versus a one-bedroom unit over there. We do have data that we collect on our Section 8 units that we rent out. And that's under 3,000 units that we have contracted up to Section 8. It certainly is information, but it's certainly not a lot of information that we can say every unit is like this, or this represents an average unit in Glendale. There were services that we looked at, Graystar, if I remember correctly, and a few others. CoStar, thank you.
CoStar has a lot of data.
Has a lot of data, but Sipan, when you had looked and discussed it with them, there were some drawbacks to, and even limits as to what they had,
Yeah,
right?
I can't remember exactly what they were, but I think one of them does, they don't have any data from 3 to 5 units, something like that. And we have like 10,000 units that are in that category. And then
They tended to have all of the newer units in
Right,
town,
newer
nothing
units.
with regards to the older units.
Right.
So even that was limited. So there is information out there. We try and get that. It's just, it's not a complete picture. And that's why rental registry, mandatory type of registration was discussed at that time. And then I was just wondering, as everyone was talking, I was remembering back to a time when the city council was interested in trying to increase the ratio of home ownership in town, in the city. And they were looking at funding special down payment assistance programs and things like that. And one of the ideas that came out was sponsoring a homebuyer education workshop taught by a certified credit counseling company, in which people can then go to lenders, applicants can then go to lenders and say, I've completed this city-sponsored program, I've got my certificate issued. And I was wondering, would there be any interest or value in setting up something like a landlord-tenant certificate of rental education or something like that, where tenants could attend and they can be instructed about all aspects of the rental rights program, anything else related to renting in Glendale. And then the same for landlords. And then as they're applying places, a landlord could say, oh, and by the way, I've attended this city's workshop and I'm a member of, and I'm educated in this, this, and this, just so you know, if you're interested in renting my place. Or a tenant can say, I'm applying for your unit and I've also attended this, so I'm well aware of my rights and that, whether that makes a difference, or whether a program like that is a good way to start the beginning of a relationship, because you mentioned beginning, middle, and then the end, how to end of a relationship. And I was wondering if that was a good beginner relationship builder.
You know, look, there was some discussion about parking earlier, you know. Years ago, the city of LA enacted something which I thought was, the landlord lawyers weren't too crazy about it, but it was a sensible measure, which was you can't change a provision in the lease and then evict based on that. Recently, they've got laws with regards to pets and things like that, but back then, what would happen, for instance, they'd say, okay, no parking, we're changing the terms of your lease, you have no parking, and the minute you park your car up, 3-day notice, perform or quit, you gotta move your car. Tenant would resist, you violated the lease provision. So those were certain sensible types of things that made sense. Currently, with what we're dealing with, when you're saying upfront, if let's say she has parking, one of the things that we do is put a nice cover sheet, and the commercial leases also use this. It's on the ARR form. All the main terms are on page 1. Why make someone have to dig through to page 7 to see if they have a 1-car parking spot or 2-car parking spot or whatever? If you were to provide, you know, now they have bed bug addendums and they have other smoke detector and carbon monoxide disclosures and lead-based and all this other stuff. the problem with some of these leases is people, most of the time, they're excited, they're ready to move into a new place, or they're stressed because they have to move into a new place. So I can tell you that I don't remember the last time I really sat there and saw people reading anything other than how much is the cashier's check supposed to be made out and who's it supposed to be made out to. So, and part of that is because everything's kind of hidden away, or it's difficult to find. I think if people would make it simpler with like cover sheets, then the person knows, okay, my rent is this much. If it's a second-year lease, it goes into this category. This is the property. The landlord discloses this is a, 1 bedroom, 1 bath, as opposed to finding out that it's, it's a garage later on. Those types of things, if they're disclosed up front, then when it's staring at you down the road, then it almost answers the dispute as to which direction you would lean. When the rent is due on the 1st, and there's a requirement that for instance, we've litigated issues on whose responsibility is it? Is it the tenant's responsibility to make sure that the landlord receives it, or is sending it enough? Well, we actually put in the leases something that says it is this party's responsibility to make sure that the rent is received. So that is clarified. The more clarification there is, the better it is. The problem is Glendale can't get in the business of start drafting leases for its people. I think what you can do as part of the education process is, just like there are some organizations that provide sample documents, you could provide a sample to people to use. It doesn't have to be very fancy. You can very simply put forth, certain provisions that I think are pretty much uniform and you'd see in almost every rental agreement, because there are landlords that will put in there absolutely no pets. Well, we know with disability laws, you can't put that. But they'll put it anyways, I think if you also put in there ahead of time, hey, if there is a disclosure to be made about disability, and now is the time, well, it would be very suspect for the person if it was on the lease, and this is where I run into problems with my landlord clients, is they'll say, the guy moved in, and a week later, they need a dog, and they send me the disability certificate. Well, there's nothing in the law that says, in the contract, you can say that at this point in time, the reason that there are no pets is because there are no known disabilities to exist, blah, 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 blah. And you put that out there, again, to some degree, to have more uniformity. Then when the person comes back and says, next week I've been, this is what I decided to do, at least there's some reference point, a marking point to go off of. And I'm just using that as an example, but it could be parking, it could be additional occupants. Some people say, okay, I can have 2 adults and 2 other occupants. Well, some people say it has to be minors. Some people say it has to be adults. Some landlords get upset. No, they were supposed to be kids. Why are they adults? You need to evict them. You can't do that, okay? So is it better to name and identify the persons? Maybe, But those are, again, these are not where the problems come up. The problems come up where there's an angle to be had here. And that's what these laws need to initiate against, is if you are dealing with, for instance, an illegal unit, you could very easily say, in the event that a legal unit has been determined, the City of Glendale finds that in accordance with Carter versus Cohen, which is a case out there, all rents shall be refunded, okay? That simplifies that, because I will tell you, the landlord that's willing to roll the dice on that at that point in time says, okay, I'm willing to roll the dice, and I got to pay them back, I got to pay them back. But if I don't, I don't. But if it's out there, I guarantee you there are going to be landlords that are not going to want to roll that dice. They'll say, you know what, just never mind.
Okay. I didn't have anything else. I don't know if any other commissioner has any.
I'll jump in for a little bit. The first line of the rental rights program says the council finds and declares that there is an increasing demand for rental housing in the city of Glendale, which has resulted in a critically low vacancy factor. This was drafted probably a decade ago, if not more than that. And until today, in 2023, we don't have a single form of data that we could point to back up anything, to figure out how, from the day this was drafted until today in 2023, how has this changed? Has it changed for the better or for the worse? The purpose of this legislation is, by any means, by a small means, in my opinion, is to try to control and mitigate the increase, the substantial increase of rental costs in this city, which, as you know, is the most costly, the most burden on any single family. It's a means to, it's a policy. It's to that addresses, the 100,000, and I'm just throwing a number out there, individuals that rent in this city. Now, I could sit here and say the mediation program is a great idea, and the workshops, great ideas. But how does that address the 100,000 people that live in this city that constantly, over the last few decades, have had their rent increased? How does that address the mass of people on a policy level? It doesn't. Everybody's talking about, the small amount of cases and trying to help those small amount of cases and to help those people with substandard living conditions, which is a problem. Absolutely is. Try to help them with eviction. It's a problem. Absolutely is. But that's not the point of this. The point of this is how do we provide a recommendation to a city council that's a policy that can help a majority of the people that have a problem, that they're looking to us and the city council to address. And honestly, I don't think we've come up with one single solution sitting here. We're talking about parking.
Because they say that it doesn't.
No,
attach to us.
I absolutely, I agree that there's a parking issue. But my point is, there's a bigger issue here. There's a big elephant in the room, and we're talking about parking.
The lack of housing in Glendale for so many years, and I blame the city itself because they didn't pay attention enough in order for them to keep up with the many people that they were coming in every single year, and they didn't plan anything.
I agree, and that's more of a land use thing, and it's not in our purview. That should be addressed by the city council as well. I agree. I've lived in Glendale my entire life, and it's dramatically changed from when I was a kid and went to Glendale High School and Roosevelt, and then Horseman before that. I've been a kid that grew up down the block, and it's dramatically changed for the worse. In most respects, my generation, we were talking earlier, my generation cannot afford to live in Glendale. We just can't. I grew up here. I cannot afford to buy a house, and nobody in my generation can. So, tenants, what recommendation can we give to the city council that is going to try to control rents at a certain rate so people can catch up a little bit, have some breathing room? That's the point. It's so unfortunate that this city and this state and maybe even this country has lost a sense of community. Nobody looks out for their neighbor. Everybody looks out for themselves. It's gone. I don't know what's happening. You tell me. But there is an issue that needs to be addressed. Rental registry is a small little ask. I'm asking for data. And people are calling in talking about, it's going to violate my privacy. You are putting yourself into the marketplace. You're renting out units and you're talking about privacy. What in the world is going on? Don't rent out the units and keep your privacy.
I agree. I
Get-
thank you for
get
that
a
passion.
real job. Get a real job. That is the answer. They live off tenants, and they are permanently in vacation in Europe. It's very sad to see that, but the situation itself, it led them to do that. They live off tenants, and they have a all year vacation. So I think some kind of business. You make profit, but you don't kill your community making that profit. Sorry to say that, but that is
I
what's
can't change
happening.
the hearts of people. That's when you're getting it. And I understand what you're saying, Isabella. But that's, I can't really, I can try to motivate someone to be better, but, a person is who they are sometime until they're not. And 100%, I love that you addressed the elephant in the room. People have to do real work. City council, I know when I was in my situation, I was told to call somebody. I did speak with that person about one time, but when I kept calling back to get real help, because as you know, things move really fast when you're dealing with a tenant-landlord issue, and especially if the landlord thinks they have the upper hand and thinks you know nothing. And the person's assistant from city council was saying they're going to get back with you when you can, and I'm sitting here in the middle of something. Thank God for the other departments that were truly helping, truly city attorney's office, even if it was just to guide me on certain things, or the other department in housing rights. People were helping, but when it came to city council, so now we have to deal with city council. What do? What is your job? Are you for the people or not? Because I believe in being for the people. Hands down. And then we have to have boots on the ground. You can't talk one thing to get elected, and then you get elected and you sit back, once the election is over, and just in any political realm, and then you sit back and do nothing and no longer hear from the people. So what you were saying, so maybe it goes back to what is the real deal? Is it rental registry? Is it rental rights? And if that's it, then we need to stand firm and do what we can to help the situation, period. And then education at the end of the day. Because understanding, units that can be rented, and under what Peter said, how can we get into buying housing and having programs that help people to elevate, to have equities and inclusion, that is important, and we have to be able to look at that. Listen, I'm going to bring this up too while we were talking about this. When I was relocating, it was interesting because there was a condominium of where I used to live in the Campbell Street area. I know for a fact I was being profiled racially. And how I know? I do data and work. And so I had a neighbor, the person immediately said, "What do you do? Why do you want this unit? Where are you coming from?" I didn't even understand, where are you coming from? Down the street? Where are you coming from? Are you from Glen? Do you want to be in Glen? Do you even have a job? Why would I not have a job? Okay. Then it was so hostile towards me, and I politely answered the questions because I just wanted to see where this was going. And then I had a friend of mine, a neighbor, call, elderly Caucasian woman, totally different tone to the fact that she called her back. This person's on a fixed income, could not even really afford it, but we did the test. Called back. So we need Glendale to pay attention to that as well, people. And the lady called her to see, do you want it? I want to talk. Do you want to come and see it? When I wanted to make the appointment, the lady even said, I'm calling you back and I'm really busy right now. And I said, well, then why did you call me back? And I wanted to get more information from her so then I could do my investigation with her. And I think she knew I was trying to do that. So there are definitely some issues. We need to understand that all races and cultures are welcomed in Glendale. No one race owns Glendale. We need to cohabitate. And again, like you said, let's educate people. First and foremost, everything I just think begins with education. But if we need to go back and say, listen, we think this, the rent control is important, then let's go with that. Let's go with that.
I was going to ask a question. You know, one of the things that was proposed previously when they were doing the, trying to enact some of the recent rental caps, was because of the housing shortage and trying to address one of the concerns that Commissioner Member Zargarian had. One of the things that was presented to city staff and in meetings with city council was, why not create an incentive program to allow, let's say, a landlord who's developing a property, whether it's a 6-unit or a 12-unit. I think we can all agree, the developers that are building the larger units on Brandon Central, whatever it is that they're doing, they're a completely different operation. I mean, that is a very sophisticated operation that's going on down there. How the city deals with that is one thing, but for instance, there are incentives that are given. If you have potentially a property developer that wants to develop an 8-unit complex, why wouldn't they allow them to develop a 10 or a 12 unit if they would agree to tie the extra units to affordable housing provisions, either low, median? That was one of the things that we said would also allow the mix. You could have the person who's living in the $2,500 2-bedroom living with someone who's well below the income level that would normally be required, but the person was able to afford it because the city said to the owner or the developer, look, you're going to put 8 units. It's not that much more to put 10 or 12 or 14, but you agree to add these additional units. There isn't a developer out there, if you offer them that type of incentive, that wouldn't seriously take that into consideration, assuming, you know, construction costs and things like that are normal, not where wood is 15 times the price. You have people in certain areas of Glendale right now that unless their building burns down, that's the only way they can put the same number of units back up. There has been, in the past, there has been downzoning of certain areas of Glendale that have far more parking available than what we're dealing with down here. But yet the city, instead of creating a corridor that would potentially add additional housing, have decided to go against that. I'll give you one example. Up and down Kenyatta Boulevard. That's North Glendale. That's a nice place for anybody to live, low or high income. And that corridor is a very high traffic area. You would think that also could support an environmental impact report that people could go either north or south. That entire corridor, I personally thought at some point in time had, because there are certain apartments that started getting built. I've lived in Glendale long enough to see the ups and downs of several cycles. And at some point there was very generous zoning laws. There was very generous approval laws, and there are some people that built some very nice buildings going up and down that street. Well, the city of Glendale at one point said, no, we're not going to do it. They stopped that. They downzoned the properties, and then now all of a sudden they're saying, well, we don't have enough housing. Well, you stop the growth. You stop the growth, and instead we have a $3,500 1-bedroom apartment just because it's got some fancy treadmill downstairs. You know, who really goes to the gym anyways? So at least by the looks of me, I don't. Not right now, at least. And by the way, I just want to say one quick thing. I want to thank the gentleman. I had an opportunity this weekend. You know, we sit here and we talk and we look at ourselves on TV. There's someone that's actually running this system. I met a gentleman by the name of Henry, who's in charge of GTV6. And I want to say thanks. He sits there and listens to us. And I'm sure there's others too. So, you know, thanks to these people for making this process look great, you know?
I'm sure
he's a
he's
great basketball player.
I'm sure he's watching now and probably zooming in on you right now, Commissioner Harapeti, and thanking you.
If he could make me look a little bit skinnier and tanned, I'm sure my family would appreciate it.
To your point, though, about land use decisions, the city has implemented certain zoning policies to help facilitate things like that. And certainly in the last few years, the state has mandated that quite a bit, to the extent that some cities are very uncomfortable with some of the new laws that have passed and the ease in which developers can build additional units in neighborhoods that many may feel it isn't appropriate for, but they're now allowed by the state of California to do so. And so those projects are going through. We have density bonus projects that are being applied for and being constructed, but they're not large numbers.
They're not.
It's really that. We might have,
10% or whatever density bonus for affordable, it's never going to work. It's got to be higher.
Right,
And-
right.
And I'm so happy that Glendale is finally building some exclusively affordable projects now, but there needs to be so many more, so many more of those.
Look what ADUs have done.
Exactly.
I mean, that explosion of ADUs has created its own little housing market in itself.
and I think the state would argue that there's not one solution, so it's a little bit of everything. So if you can get every year maybe 10 density bonus projects that result in maybe 20 more units of affordable housing, if you can get ADUs being developed at the clip of 180 units, ADUs a year, and then couple that with some other zoning land use decisions they've made that would allow in commercial zones for a large added number of residential units to be in there without much review. I think that's what the state is hoping for, that it will ease that.
But I think, again, if you were to give a developer an incentive, for instance, like with the ADU, if there was a fee built in that, okay, with a certain amount, with an ADU application, a certain amount goes towards low-income housing projects, or if a developer wants to take advantage of additional units at an option that's given, that there's an additional fee to be paid. Now you've got all this extra income coming in that can now be utilized. They've talked about opportunity zones, but I haven't really seen that take off yet. And it just, I don't know how the bureaucracy within the city works to get that going, but there was discussion that down in South Glendale that there was going to be this massive change in appearance and housing, and especially since the Americana was down there, it was going to be along the Chevy Chase and Palmer corridor.
Right, and let me just say that the city does have, so if you have that philosophy at the state level of all of these laws that they're passing to allow more density, the city does have and recently received an approved housing element by the state of California saying that with your projections of the number of units you need, you have properly upzoned a large number of your properties in Glendale that allow for that size development. And so the city is doing everything it can, including with an approved housing element. But, with the density bonus program, you can tell people, developers, I'll give you 50% more units. It gets to a point, though, that you can't build that many units on a site. I don't want to go, developers will say, well, I don't want to go down to a third level. I'm going to hit water of subterranean parking. I'm not doing that. The cost for that is just much more. There's only so much I can squeeze in a unit and squeeze it down to accommodate more units, that my one-bedroom unit's now 600 square feet. That's not in my pro forma. That doesn't get me the money I need for a viable development over 20 years. So those density bonus programs work only to a certain percentage.
But go back 20 years and look at all the little projects that have been built, the 8 units, the 6 units, the 12 units, and add an extra 2 to 4 units to each of those. Look at how much more housing you would have had now, right? That would have been a ton more housing, because let's face it, there was a time here where, and I expect that at some point it will again, where you're going to have a higher vacancy rate. It's cyclical. So I don't know, but they didn't project that back then.
I know we're wrapping up, we're bumping up against our time to end. Anyone else? No?
I guess just one more thing. I know the city has, a few thousand units of housing that they've provided to low-income individuals. And I know they had a program years ago where they would allow the low-income individuals, families to purchase those units. I think one other thing I would recommend to the city is just to allow these individuals that are in the unit to purchase those units. The biggest gain that especially over the past few years, that any family that owns a unit has, the appreciation on those units, gets people out of poverty. That's one thing that supports families and the next generation. I think housing is beyond just the tenant aspect of it. Is if the city can assist in families and individuals owning those units, whether part of some sort of HOA or whatever the city decides. But I think a program aimed at that angle would also be beneficial.
Okay. We used to have a much more robust program when we had redevelopment, and redevelopment was funding affordable housing development. And we were receiving at the high, we were receiving about $10 million a year from the redevelopment department, specifically for affordable housing. So we had first-time homebuyer programs, we had condo conversion programs.
Yeah, I remember that.
Whole bunch of programs that all went away when the state of California eliminated redevelopment. And now we're just living off the remaining funding that we received from the redevelopment that we were able to hold on to, and federal funding. And some funding by the city council of Measure S. A large amount of money has gone into affordable housing as well and programming. So it's been very difficult to recreate some of the stuff that we used to have some 15, 20 years ago.
See, the thing is, the city already owns that land. If for example, there's 100 units, 50 units in that building, and they find obviously appropriate buyers and finance that property, finance that condo, they could basically take that money and do it again.
Mm-hmm. We do have programs like that where we developed affordable homeownership programs where the unit needs to be affordable and resold to another qualifying family at an affordable purchase price.
Oh.
And then we take the units are just continually being used as affordable housing. We still have those that are in their different cycles.
Do they still have the shelter care program with the city?
We still have our continuum of care program that offers homeless housing programs. Shelter Plus Care is one of them.
With us, we had worked with Shelter Care, and I will tell you that the one thing that they were doing a phenomenal job with back then is the city would get involved. They would screen the applicants. They would bring people in, and these were obviously people that needed as much assistance as possible. At the time, the faculties that the city had, those were some of the best tenants that you could ask for, and it was a phenomenal program. I found both personally and also with my own clients that they were much more empathetic, sympathetic, and way more flexible with that type of a tenant structure than they were with the regular higher paying tenant. And it's sad as those types of programs, I don't see them as much anymore. And there would be an incentive. For instance, they would give like an extra security deposit up front, and that would, wow, okay, great. And you give the person a leg up. That individual got a chance. They got a home. They were happy. The landlord was happy. There was and again, once you left it to their relationship, it just worked, And it was never only about the money. So I think that I agree with you with this loss of sense of community. That is an element of it. But I think that a lot of time is being spent on stuff that is, I think, is affecting the majority from moving forward.
All right. Well, we've reached that moment in the meeting, and we can certainly continue this discussion at our next meeting.
Can we look at our agenda and make sure we've gone through all of it?
Over here.
So we're just going to go through
All right.
the rest of the agenda.
Next on the agenda item, we have committee comments and staff comments. Does anybody have any comments they'd like to make?
Beyond what we've been talking about today, that,
Okay, if there are no comments, there's no new business, so we will move on to our final agenda item, adjournment. Our next meeting will be May 2nd, May 24th.
get a motion to adjourn.
It's Memorial Day
I
weekend
second
is
the
when?
motion.
The weekend after.
After, okay.
Right?
It's the Wednesday
we-
before, it's the Wednesday before.
Okay.
Wednesday before Memorial Day.
Okay.
We stay adjourned at 8:02.